Hey, I'm Jason.
I'm Nick.
And I'm Emily. So, Peyton, what's the first thing we're going to be talking about?
The first person we're going to be talking about is Margaret Coggan and her decision to abandon her family and go into hiding in Lithuania.
So, Margaret Coggan's family decided that they were going to stay in Germany during the Holocaust because she had a younger sister who was in a children's camp that they didn't want to leave behind.
So, why was Margaret Coggan's family a target of the Holocaust?
They were Jewish.
And they had the means to leave?
Yes, they were able to leave, but they decided that they didn't want to leave her behind, and they wanted to stay together as a family. From there, they were moved into the ghettos.
So, who were her parents?
Margaret's mother was an immigrant, and her father worked for the Lithuanian embassy in Berlin.
So, she moved out of the ghetto eventually, right?
She made the choice to leave the ghettos to live with a man named Joseph.
So, what compelled her to make the choice to break off from her family and escape the ghetto when her family had gone in there to stay together?
He was a very convincing person. He offered to help the people that were in the ghettos, especially her family, and they would steal and live off of what they stole. And he would say things to her like, we shouldn't have to live this life in the ghettos. It's not fair,
So, Joseph convinced Margaret to leave the ghettos and try to kind of hide out for a while.
Yeah. He was also convinced that anyone who was Jewish was eventually going to be killed, which he ended up being right on, but he didn't really have anything that he was going off of, and he convinced Margaret to go into hiding and leave her family behind.
So, in the end, her family was shuttled off to a concentration camp while the two of them escaped?
Yes. Her father died in the concentration camp, and her mother shot herself.
How long did Margaret go into hiding for?
About 9 months.
Okay, and did the younger sibling just survive?
Her younger sibling did survive, the one that they waited for.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all that they said survived.
So, after she went into hiding, she came out of hiding. What caused her to leave? What caused her to break out of hiding? What caused her to reemerge into the world?
Eventually, in July 1944, Soviet troops reached them and they were set free.
So, the Soviets rescued them?
They did. And that was when she found out about her mother and father and was reunited with her younger sister.
So, after they escaped from the camps, did she choose to stay with Joseph?
Yes, she did. They ended up working together and building a life together.
So what did she do?
They ran a textile company.
And did she reconnect with her sister? And did they spend time together after the war? Did they meet up?
Yeah, they did. Her sister was the only one that had remained. So naturally she became very close with her, and it was a horrible thing to go through, to come out of hiding, find out that most of your family was gone, and she was the last one.
All right.
The next person we're going to be talking about is Victor Clem Tremper, a German Jew who decided to stay in Germany during the Holocaust.
Victor was not the only one affected in his decision to stay in Nazi Germany. Another one of the people who was affected in very real ways was his wife, Eva Clem Tremper. She chose to stay with him, even though both or either of them had the capability to leave Germany throughout the horrors of concentration camp and existence under the Nazi state.
So why did he decide to stay then?
The biggest reason, it seems, that Victor decided to stay was his idea of the German identity and how it would be wrong of him to abandon the country to those people that he viewed as lunatics and fanatics.
So he put him and his wife in danger because he believed it would be un-German of him to leave?
That seems to be the case, and it can be said that leaving was not, well, it was definitely a process that they were capable of doing, and it was a process that they had the tools to do. It was not an easy one, and for many, it looked like this Nazi storm before they were, the Nazis, once they fully seized power, made it extremely difficult or impossible for them to leave. So once they had fully seized power, they would not have been able to leave.
Yeah.
And many people, especially people like Clem, who existed in circles that had low rates of Nazism and areas that had little Nazi fervor in them, believed that the Nazi control was a fad or a political storm that would blow over and leave them in peace at the end. So they felt like fleeing from this would have been a mistake because they would have lost their homes and everything that they had with them.
But at the same time, staying made it really, really hard on his wife.
And staying made it really, really hard on him. And while we can say that he himself was definitely able to make his own decision on that, is it fair to say that he had a responsibility to his wife for him to leave the country so that she might just go with him?
Yeah, I think it would have been difficult for either of them to leave. Like you said, they had a home. They felt secure there. They thought the whole thing was going to blow over, but it didn't. But you did say that they had the opportunity to leave, like, even after they found out it wasn't just a fad, right?
For about a 3-week period after the Nazis seized power, they were mostly killing off their political rivals, and so spent little time enforcing emigration laws and keeping Jews from being able to leave their country. And that was the period in which he could have escaped.
Right. So, again, it's the same reason. He wanted to be German. He didn't want to leave and be un-German.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what his wife felt about any of this?
We don't have as much of a good window into his wife's thoughts and feelings due to the fact that the journal is his and written from his point of view. But we can infer from it, reading it, that she felt attached to him a lot more than she felt attached to the idea of staying or the idea of leaving.
Right.
And she was unwilling, and she seemed to be unwilling to go without him, nor unwilling to stay if he was not going to stay. She seemed like she was bound to him.
Right. So his decision to stay affected her, even if that may not necessarily be what she had wanted. Even though what she wanted was to stay with him, she could have also wanted to leave and, have that peace of mind that she was really safe.
That is definitely accurate. And I don't think it's fair to say that he was responsible to her for staying.
Right.
Because she had the power to leave without him.
She did, yeah.
And especially since she was the one who was actually Aryan and he was the one who was actually Jewish. But I feel that because she had the option to leave without him if she wanted to, it was not his responsibility nor his obligation to leave with her because she had the ability to escape on her own.
Did his journal say anything about, what she wanted to do? She was Aryan, so she would have been much safer than he was, correct?
Except that by being married to him, she was in a gray area for the Nazis of being both Aryan and considered to be Jewish, that resulted in her getting thrown in the concentration camp with him when the two of them were taken in.
Right.
So she experienced a lot of the same effects of the Holocaust that he did.
Yeah. I feel like they really should have left, though.
But you can't just look at it as the idea of what was right for them. Perhaps the two of them had decided to stay in light of the idea of what something like the journals, when coming out, could have.
Right.
He knew that he was going to write it. He knew that he was in the perfect position to write an inside-eyes view of the rise and existence of Nazism.
But there was no guarantee that he would have lived through to tell the story.
No, but it's really hard to get rid of a book once it's able to be released or set out. And it is known that he had associates who had the capability, at least until they were captured in the concentration camps, to come into contact with him rather regularly. So it's possible that he could have, if he was going to be imprisoned, could have surrendered his manuscripts to them.
Right.
And they could have been able to distribute it. Because once people start copying and printing a book, getting rid of it becomes very, very difficult very, very quickly.
It does.
Now, the book's effect on history is a rather interesting one. It has existed for quite a few years in the form of the documents and manuscripts for it, but it hasn't been published in an easy-to-read, easy-to-assemble form until about 1978, when the first mass-produced copy that was translated into several languages came out. And that almost immediately became a bestseller and gives a lot of people a view and an idea of what it was really like for Jews and anyone else to exist under the Nazi state.
So if they would have left, they would have basically been guaranteed safety, but because they did stay, they did have this sort of financial compensation for it.
Not financial compensation, even so much as...
You said the book became a bestseller.
Yes.
Were they dead by this time?
At least she was, and he died shortly after.
Right.
So I would say more the effect was what he had on posterity. If I would point out the fact that a book like that, being able to point out the horrors of Nazi rule, makes people less likely to support any similar fervor or movement to that inside of their own nation or state, and would therefore make his effect on history through his book one that helps the world and perhaps justifies the risk that he took in staying.
Were his values, like, being German? What did he define as being German?
He defined Germanness as a steadfast hand at whatever task you're in, an application of the ideas that you have, and a pragmatic, realistic point of view. One of his better quotes was one he was looking at a set of thugs who were working for the Nazis who were beating up a Jewish street keeper, and he said, "These people, they are un-German." Fanaticism is inherently un-German. This lack of thought is inherently un-German.
So German is more of an idea rather than, like, speaking the language, being Aryan, being born there?
It's, he defined it not necessarily as a people or as a legal system or as a language, but he defined it more as a set of values that a being could possess or not possess.
All right. Was his decision to stay affected by his military service?
He served in the war extensively before he won 2 Iron Crosses, and that might have strengthened his patriotic feelings towards Germany, as a lot of people who are in military forces do tend to have stronger patriotic leanings.
Exactly, yeah.
Which definitely supports the idea that that would help him to stay. But I would argue that it was more his work in the field of literature and the way that he defined the German identity that caused him to stay than his military service affecting the way that he thought about himself or his nation.
Winston Churchill was the leader of Great Britain through the majority of World War II. He helped create the alliance against the Axis and supported a strong push to invade North Africa.
Before serving as Prime Minister in World War II, Churchill was a devoted anti-socialist, which made his decision to ally with the USSR all the more interesting.
He was strongly against Hitler being more important than the opposition to Stalin, correct?
He seemed to believe that during World War II, it was his job to pull together all of the important allies. As he worked on working with the U.S., he worked on trying to convert Italy over when they were willing to surrender. He seemed to be trying to pull together as many people as possible to oppose Germany. But this is interesting because even before and during the war and after it, in very majorly, he was against the Soviet Union in a lot of its propositions. Like, the Soviets wanted a second front for a long time to help distract attention from the Russians who were destroying them. And he opposed the idea of a second front invasion for as long as he was able to.
Okay.
And after the war, he gave a famous speech in which he coined the term the Iron Curtain and declared the Soviets the enemy of the democracies of the world. Even before the war, there was a measure put forth that would allow the government to requisition objects during times of trouble. And he viewed that as a socialist work piece.
He was against that.
He was firmly against the concept of government requisitions. But then, almost the moment that he came into the war as its leader, he passed the British Government Requisitions Act, which allowed any government of body or official to requisition any piece of property for any length of time, with compensation to be decided and paid out after the war, which is an extremely socialist piece of policy, as they have the collectivization of property, and that is collectivizing property when decided to.
Right.
Which,
No, go ahead.
which contributes to the idea that he was prioritizing winning the war higher than he was any other piece or idea that he was working on.
So he would have put like his own like values, like opposing things like Hitler, socialism, things like that, like above or below winning the war.
He considered them, it seems at least, to be much less important. Which once again brings us back to the second front idea, because it was definitely a good idea for pushing for the conclusion of the war. It's very hard to defeat a country without invading them. Yet he was flagrantly against it up until the last moment he was able to be.
So he just seemed kind of tired of the war.
It seems almost that he was opposing it because it would help the Russians a lot.
Right.
Well, at this time, the Soviets. It was still the USSR. And this, basically from the second that the war ended, he was against and opposing, working against the Soviet Union. During this working with people who reside in what is now Russia idea has been commonly seen throughout his service in the First World War. He advocated for and attempted to launch 3 separate offensives that would allow him to connect his forces to those of the Russians and allow the two of them to open up a channel for troop and flow movement. And after, when the unified armies were opposing the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution, he was one of the most stringent supporters of continued fighting and managed to lengthen the war significantly against the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
But eventually that force lost out in the end.
Do we think this helped him, or this kind of attitude helped him win World War II?
An opposition to the Soviets, or the complete commitment to the war over any one of his other political, moral, or
Ethical?
ideological ideas?
The second one.
Virtually certainly. The Requisitioning Act was immensely helpful. You've heard of the evacuation at Dunkirk, right?
Yes.
The evacuation at Dunkirk, a lot of those boats a lot of the civilian boats weren't being driven by civilian pilots. They were requisitioned and brought over.
Right.
You've heard of the operation to break the Enigma code, right?
Right.
That was working in requisitioned area, a manor outside that was the home of some lord or another, using people who he had pulled off of universities and using, at times, requisitioned equipment to build things like their computers. It was immensely helpful for their attempts at winning the war for him to be passing those laws, even though they were in direct opposition to what it appears to be basically everything that he believed in.
Right. So his willingness to give up what he believes in helped him win the war, as well as, because that was his last way to push to defeat his enemy.
What do you think?
Almost inarguably.
What do you think helped him make the decision to pick the war over like his values?
Previous to the war, and especially during World War I, he had been very anti-German. And even before the war had started, he'd been advocating a tougher stance. He disliked the Munich Agreement because he believed that it was kissing up to Hitler, and that he had a famous quote, which is, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor and you will get war anyway." And he shows that he's been anti-German during the First World War. He was anti-German during the build-up to it. Mm-hmm. And he was very focused on battles and conflict in his work before he became the prime minister. He was a soldier, and then a politician, and then a soldier, and then a politician, and then a soldier again.
Right.
Writing on the side. He worked as a war correspondent for a good piece of his career. And so he was brought up with conflict. He worked inside of war in the past, and due to the First World War, he was very polarized against the Germans.
Right.
So his military background helped defeat the Germans as well.
It helped him make this decision too.
I would
helped
think
him make the decision to give up his beliefs for the war.
It seems that his military background and his previous experience in the First World War helped him arrive in a state where he was able to make these choices in order to defeat the Germans in the end.
Right.
And he considered that worth it over, giving up what
He seems to have
believed in?
considered that worth it.
Yeah.
The Requisitions Act was abolished afterwards, so his loss in that regard was rather temporary.
Mm-hmm.
D-Day is the beginning date of any military operation. However, the phrase is now most associated with Operation Overlord, General Eisenhower's invasion of Normandy that spelled the end of the war against Germany.
So how did General Eisenhower decide on the date that he did for D-Day?
He wanted to do it as soon as possible. However, he also wanted to do it when the weather permitted, so he had the best chance with wind, precipitation, and seas.
How did precipitation affect their capability to launch D-Day?
Most of the soldiers who were deployed on D-Day arrived in sea-to-land vehicles, which were deployed from the warships and were taking up through water and would go into the land and lower their door for their soldiers to walk out on. And if there were dangerous seas from precipitation and wind, then there was a good chance of them tipping or getting blown over, injuring soldiers. And another good majority of the soldiers were also paratroopers, so they would parachute down into the beaches.
Wet parachutes are less effective.
So if it's too windy, too rainy, the seas were too rough, it could have caused him to fail. And when the day that they planned to do it, ended up having a bad weather forecast, and that was on June 6th. However, he couldn't wait just for a long time because he knew the tides wouldn't be in his favor for another 2 weeks, and he wanted to push it. Science.
Oh, was he looking for the highest possible tide, the lowest possible tide? What was he looking for in his tides for the D-Day invasion?
He was looking for the highest tide so he could get further up on the beaches.
And spend the minimum amount of time on the beaches?
Right.
Did he necessitate a day when he could fly aircraft? Was that one of his criteria? Because I know the Allied air advantage was very important in a lot of the operations that took place in Europe.
Right, nearly 10,000 aircraft were deployed, and if the weather did not permit, then the planes at that time wouldn't have been able to fly.
Fly in the weather?
Right. And so he decided to wait another day and see how the weather would do.
But he wasn't willing to wait the full 2-week cycle?
Right. So less than 24 hours later, they decided to hold a meeting and see if the next day would be permitted, which it ended up being, and they chose to invade on June 5th, 1944.
So, when the invasion was being conducted, why did they decide to go with the beaches that they did, seeing as those beaches were heavily fortified, and those weren't the closest point between England and Germany?
They had created a ruse on the beaches of the United Kingdom island, where they created a whole series of fake tanks, trucks, troops to make it look like they were going to invade North Normandy to get the Axis troops to expect an invasion of there. They even sent fake radio broadcasts, and they were hoping that through that ruse they'd be able to invade South Normandy in a much easier way with less fortified defenses and be able to kind of close in on the German troops.
And secure a beachhead before they could be pushed back into the sea.
Right.
Why did they decide to split the troops across 5 beaches? Did they not want to go all in on an area that could be too fortified? And doesn't splitting up like that risk you being unable to take any of them due to lack of concentrated firepower?
Yes, but okay. So he decided to spread it across 5 beaches because the Allies had an enormous amount of troops, 160,000 invasion troops. They had 4,000 warships and 10,000 aircraft. And so they knew that even spread out among the 5 beaches, they had an overwhelming force against normal German defenses. And they were hoping that even if there was a tank brigade or fort from the Germans, if they concentrated all their troops in one place, they wouldn't be obliterated all at once. So they decided to spread it out and maybe have one of the 5 get obliterated and still advance the other 4.
So that even if there were superior fortifications, they would still be capable of holding their invasion.
Right.
So, you mentioned a false army that distracted German attention during the landings on D-Day. What were you talking about with that?
England decided to create a fake army out of inflatable tanks and cardboard soldiers, as well as vehicles, and even made fake radio transmissions, hoping that the Germans would pick them up, all to make it seem like they would invade North Normandy.
And that was designed to distract German attention so that they would have time to get a beachhead together before the attack came?
Right, as well as weakened fortifications where they were attacking, where the actual attack was happening.
So that was designed to just buy them time and buy them space so that they could get their beachhead down. And combined with their sabotage operations, that was able to pin people and troops out of locations.
Right.
So,
How did they get this inspiration to do this? That's a pretty clever idea. Had it been used in the past, maybe, or?
Yeah, it had been seen in the past, and inspiration for this could be seen as possibly the Trojan horse used way long ago.
For deception and everything?
Yeah.
So, what allowed the Allies to fool the Germans? What made the Germans decide to pay attention to the fake landings? Was there this campaign that was used to attempt to hide the real ones? Were they... I read somewhere about a submarine in plans, something about that being used.
Well, they did a lot of trickery to make it seem like they were building an army and about to invade Pas de Calais, which is 30 miles, from the beaches of England, which makes perfect sense for the Allies to try to retake the continent from there. Although what they actually did was made it look like they were going to invade the beaches of Normandy, which was over 100 miles away. And they set up fake construction. They set up fake tanks, fake troop movements, fake naval movements.
So their own spy work and radio transmission interception technology, along with a preconceived idea that the shortest gap would be the ones that the British would want to leap, would combine to make the Germans believe that the fake landing was the one that the Allies would attempt.
Right, and to keep the actual destination under wraps where they were actually going to invade, they created So the actual operation of invading Normandy was called Operation Overlord, and then they created Operation Fortitude, which created 2 fake armies, one in Scotland and one in England, which the one in Scotland was to kind of make it seem like they're going to invade Norway. And the fake army created to make it look like they were going to invade Pas-de-Calais was known as Quicksilver, which was the established first U.S. Army group. And it was also sent words that, or it was there were words sent that it was led by a U.S. general that or lieutenant that was supposed to be like a really, really hardcore, real blood and guts general that kind of
Patton?
General George S. Patton.
Was one of the more effective commanders in Africa. So when they were tracking their general, that also helped contribute to the deception.
Right.
In another one of Italy's poorly done military adventures, it decided to invade Greece in late October of 1940. Due to a lack of planning, it was a disaster that required German intervention to keep from
Mussolini was feeling cowed by Hitler's military conquests and success, and he therefore decided that he needed to hold an invasion of some other foreign land, and he chose Greece.
So did he do this to prove his equality with Hitler?
I think that that's a fair statement, seeing as the documents that we have of his seem to show that the more success that the Germans had, the more he felt like an inferior partner, when he really felt like he deserved to be treated equally, and the more he felt like Hitler was treating him and his country like a child because they were so much less effective than the German forces and the German leadership. So he may have wanted to prove that he can do things well too when he decided to invade Greece, and really he proved the exact opposite.
I was going to say, wouldn't it set them back a lot farther if the invasion was unsuccessful? Like, they would need help, or...
Yes, but he viewed Greece as an easy target.
Right.
Because...
He thought it would be only 2 weeks before he finished the invasion.
And he viewed himself as having little to no chance of failure in this venture. So he thought that invading Greece could never go wrong. And so that it was a surefire way to prove that he was capable of acting as a military force.
And he went through with this, even though he was very indecisive and actually had no concrete plan, along with deep divisions in his command staff.
His command staff was arguing between about 3 different plans in the lead up to the invasion. And almost on the day of, he decided which one he wanted to go with. It was very poorly designed. And when he lost, he was originally planning to bring 15 regiments of troops in his attempt to push for Greece on the date, but one of the troop trains that he had bringing soldiers in, its rail line collapsed, and so he was able to bring only 7 of his brigades, half of his original force in, and he decided to push in with the invasion anyway. That was probably one of the more key decisions, as the plan was already very optimistic in how much they could accomplish with the troops that they had, and having the number of troops available while leaving the goals of the invasion the same probably contributed to its lack of focus and lack of success.
Okay. And his son-in-law was one of the more optimistic commanders as well, correct?
Yes, his son-in-law was one of the primary pushing voices towards an invasion as soon as possible and with an aggressive as a plan as possible. And due to his marriage to Mussolini's daughter, he had a ear to Mussolini in a way that a lot of his other generals did not, which almost certainly contributed to his decision to go with such an aggressively early invasion date and such an aggressively early invasion plan.
Okay.
How did the invasion actually go?
So a surge of Italian troops crossed the border into Greece. They continued unabated for a few miles, and they broke up into different groups. Some groups would go to pursue targets like cities, and some would pursue targets like military bases, and some would take strategically important crossroads and attempt to hold them.
So would you say that there was a gain, or the gain was bigger than what they lost?
No, it was an absolute rout, and they collapsed, because each team that they were sending off was woefully unprepared to take its individual target. They were assaulting fortresses with less people than the defenders had, which almost never goes well. They were attempting to take towns with just a few hundred people, which simply wasn't enough. And having their invasion force really didn't help with the problem of being dreadfully, dreadfully understaffed for his invasion.
Okay. And this invasion kind of destabilized the Axis plans to keep control of the oil.
So they
to focus on
had
the Soviet Union.
no real oil production capabilities anywhere in Europe. So there were three ways that they were acquiring oil. First one is that they were getting it shipped in through the Balkans and Greece.
Okay.
Important term being Greece, which was their open trading partner before. The second one was that they were going to try to pull it out of Africa, which is another one of Italy's terrible plans, which the Germans once again had to step in and try. And the third one was that the Russians have a lot of oil fields. Mm-hmm. And so they were going to attempt to capture the Russian ones. And the Italians just did actually twofold things to cut off their supply of oil. They threatened the Balkan trade routes by declaring war with Greece. And they threatened the push for the oil fields in Russia by distracting both their forces and the Germans' forces to attempt to fight the stabilizing war south. The original Axis plan was to take over Britain, which failed due to the failure in the Battle of the Blitz of Britain over Britain in the skies to cow British resistance.
Right.
And so being unable to do that, Germany's plan was to focus exclusively on Russia, gain control of Moscow, the oil fields, and then they would be able to move down, take over Africa, and move by a theater-by-theater targeted approach. But Italy, in its haste to start a war in every country on Earth, managed to greatly detract from this plan by splitting it off into three separate fronts that they had to fight on.
Right, yeah.
And destabilizing the ability of the Axis to focus their forces in taking in Russia.
So, even though it was clear he had already failed by the time he got there, he decided to go through with the plan.
Not necessarily clear that he had failed, but his lack of troops meant that just waiting a little bit may have even resulted in something that was more successful, due to the fact that he'd have more than twice as many troops as he had.
So you could argue that his own incompetence and impatience caused his failure.
Major piece. The Greeks, he told the Greek prime minister that he was going to invade Greece before he was aware of his plan of how to invade Greece.
That gives them a lot of time to prepare.
Yes. They didn't have a plan together while the Greeks were mobilizing to resist them.
While he faced this difficult decision, he also made poor decisions.
Yes, Mussolini was a disaster. His plan, he didn't believe that the Greeks would attempt to resist. He demanded a bunch of concessions from them, and they thought that they would give in. Well, Metaxas, the Greek prime minister at the time, instead left the summit that he was holding with Mussolini, went back to Greece, and started mobilizing all of their forces in an attempt to resist them, the Italian invasion.
Okay.
The key word there being Italian invasion. He didn't even pre-plan this with the Germans. He attempted to go at it alone, and once he had failed, Hitler had to send in forces to swoop in and stabilize his disastrous assault.
Because he wanted to prove that he could be useful at something.
When what he really proved was that he was worthless.
Really, though?
Actually worse than worthless, because he was not only not doing anything helpful, he was detracting from their focus, and he did eventually get the Balkan oil routes cut off.
Right.
But that wasn't the overall goal.
No, that was the opposite of his goal. The invasion of Greece did far more damage to the Axis plan than it helped it.
So the day that he planned on going and invading Greece was the same day that he decided to conduct the March on Rome, which was 18 years earlier. Do you think that those two are related in any way?
Almost certainly. He viewed the March on Rome as his great social, political achievement, and he hoped to view the invasion of Greece as a great military one.
So he wanted to be known socially and militarily throughout the world.
As a great leader, when really he wound up proving himself to be not very clever and positively worthless.
He left the exact opposite effect of what he was trying to get.
The Munich Agreement was an agreement between France, Germany, Britain, and Italy that allowed Germany to annex a part of Czechoslovakia in the lead-up to World War II.
Neville Chamberlain spearheaded the creation of the Munich Agreement as a response to German claims to Czechoslovakia. So, why do we think that Neville Chamberlain wanted to try so hard to appease Germany in the lead-up to World War II?
To prevent World War II.
There's also the idea that he was buying time under the assumption that war was probably inevitable. Because entering, at least at the time of the Munich Agreement, Britain and France were woefully underprepared to defend against any sort of German attack. And so it's been at least postulated that he would attempt to enter into agreements and do anything that he could to stall time in order to give his defenses time to create, in order to give the army time to draft up, and in order to give time for industry to shift into gear for the production of war material.
Right, so France and Britain didn't feel they were ready to engage in territory that wasn't even their own, and they felt like they needed to create time in order to prepare.
Or they wanted to natively, but still well-mindedly, attempt to prevent the war outcome of World War II altogether. I personally think that Neville Chamberlain was stalling for time, but because I tend to doubt that someone would be that foolish as to truly believe that he could stop that war, but his press announcements and the fact that the time he created he mostly wasted really does lend a strong point to the idea that he was not stalling for time. He honestly believed that by seceding territory, he could appease Hitler.
So what was the decision he was trying to make?
In the end, he has to decide, do they go to war now and attempt to get the Soviet Union to go in with them, because it also had defense agreements with Czechoslovakia? Or do we wait, secede Czechoslovakia to the Germans, and either, if that was his intention A, buy time, or if that was his intention B, allow prevent the outcome of World War II altogether and keep it from ever even happening?
Okay, so his decision was to either trade lives and territory for time, or engage in war that he was not prepared for.
True, or he could have been making a decision between preventing the war altogether, at least in his mind, or trading off Czechoslovakia. And we can see that Russia was willing to assist in the Czechoslovakian conflict due to their defense agreements with Czechoslovakia.
Right.
But after Czechoslovakia was seceded to the Germans, they did make the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that resulted in them agreeing to not engage in warfare against the Germans. So in attempting to strengthen his position, if that was Chamberlain's goal, he might have actually wound up undermining himself more than he supported his own plan.
Okay. So he did choose to
secede it to the
succeed.
Germans. He did in the end. That's
Germans.
what the Munich Agreement was eventually made up of. And we can make the generous assumption that he was trying to buy time for them, which honestly did wind up buying about a year and a half and greatly helped.
So if this was the correct decision, was it made wrong by how they wasted the time that they bought by doing all of this?
I mean, in the end, they did wind up sabotaging themselves by losing the support of the Russians, at least temporarily. And they did mostly spend the time that they bought pretending that World War II wasn't going to happen. So there is definitely an argument to be made that it doesn't matter that they were attempting to buy time when all they did was delay something and not prepare for it at all, completely squandering what they bought.
Mm-hmm.
The French did do a decent bit of preparing to actually partake in the Second World War during that time, but most of their preparation was on a defensive line that was rendered completely ineffective by the wonderful concept of driving around the thing that wants to shoot you. It was really a terrible tactical decision on their part.
Okay, and is it ever reasonable to hope for a permanent diplomatic solution to expansionist regimes like Germany?
In the end, the German expansion needed to be met through war and conflict, and the closest that we can have as an analog throughout the other pieces of history for empires that were eventually brought down without having the war, directly at least, would be the Soviet Union, which was an expansionist regime, but due to the presence of nuclear weapons, they were unable to engage in open warfare with world powers like Germany had. And so they were stuck fighting proxy conflicts that we also fought, where each side poured weapons and troops to support a smaller war off to the side instead of actually engaging in real land warfare or territorial expansionism. So to a certain degree, it seems to be more possible now that nuclear warfare gives countries the option for mutually assured destruction. But when that wasn't an option that countries had, it really doesn't seem like that was a viable option for them in an attempt to stop the outset of World War II altogether through bargaining.
So we agree that you can't expect expansionist regimes like Germany to hold true to their word, like how it was expected of Germany in the Munich Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That the idea that they cannot necessarily be trusted is generally a true one, as we can see throughout history, and that especially in the case of the Munich Agreement or any one of
World
the...
War II in general.
And with Neville Chamberlain's experience as British Prime Minister, do you think he knew that as well?
I would say that he was really hoping that the diplomatic solution could be achieved due to the fact that he was around during the First World War as a figure. And the First World War had a massive psychological effect on a lot of the people who were in it because of its devastating consequences. So I would argue that he was definitely biased towards making any decision that he could that in an attempt to stave off war, in the hope that doing so would prevent another repeat of the devastating conflict that was the First World War.
So you could say that he's afraid of war.
I would say that he was terrified of it. And that could have clouded his ability to perceive the fact that Germany couldn't be trusted because he was just hoping fervently that they could.
So this discussion brings us back to the first question. Was his decision correct to go ahead and give parts of Czechoslovakia to Germany in order to prevent war?
And I would believe that it wasn't, because he lost the support of the Russians, at least for a while. And it turned out that the time that he bought, he mostly spent pretending that a war wasn't going to happen. At least from a tactical standpoint or a historical one, it doesn't seem to have been particularly effective. But he, not knowing that it wouldn't work, it might have been the right decision at the time.
So he probably made the decision thinking, war is going to happen, I don't want war. Let's try to find a diplomatic solution to it. Even though we don't trust Germany, maybe they'll pull out and it'll turn out good.
And he might not have been aware that the Russians were willing to support the Czechoslovakians. And he also might not have thought of the fact that they would lose a country if they waited. So, in his mind, he sees a potential way to avoid a war, and at least France and himself might become more prepared during that time, whereas Germany seems to be fully set up to enter a war right now. And so buying time might just be the best thing for us. He wasn't aware of the losses that would be created by spending that way.
But even then,
Right.
he didn't spend the time that he bought wisely at all.
He didn't, which is why it was, at least from a historical point of view, a poor
terrible
agreement
decision.
design.
Right.
But
In the
he
time-
doesn't know that it's not going to help him.
Right. So at the time, it was probably a good decision, but as history played out, it turned out to be terrible.
It turned out that they were not making the correct choice.
Right.
Harry Truman came into office after President Roosevelt passed away, giving him control of the Manhattan Project, the American effort to create atomic weapons. 2 were dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which ended the war against Japan.
At the end of the war, Japan was the only country left to be fought. However, the U.S. did not want to invade and risk the casualties suffered on D-Day in the beaches of Normandy. President Harry Truman had the option to drop the nuclear weapon on Japan. This was seen as a way to prevent millions of casualties. However, they did not expect the radiation sickness. When the bomb was first dropped from the plane Enola Gay, it instantly killed 70,000 Japanese, following a 100,000 casualty count from radiation poisoning. Many say the bomb should not have been dropped and that it was a poor decision. However, others support Harry Truman and say it was the only way to get Japan to surrender.
It's said that one of the goals of dropping the atomic bombs was to prevent the loss of the lives of many Japanese civilians. How does nuking Japanese civilians save Japanese civilians?
Okay, so as seen in other invasions such as D-Day, millions of casualties were accounted for. And the projected casualty count for Japan was tremendous, especially because civilians were trained to resist soldiers, and Japanese soldiers committed suicide to win. So Truman feared in order to beat the Japanese, he would have to force them into extinction, killing all of the Japanese. And he didn't want to do that. So he offered a surrender, conditional surrender, and the Japanese said no. But they did kind of make a sign that they'd be okay with doing a unconditional surrender. However, when the U.S. offered a conditional surrender, they also said if you decline, it will result in total destruction. And after Japan's refusal to surrender, 2 days later, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing 70,000 and saying 100,000 radiation sickness. Radiation sickness not being accounted for. So Harry Truman, when making the decision, was only aware that approximately 70,000 would die.
From the giant nuclear blast.
Right. Instead of millions of casualties of men, women, children, and Japanese soldiers, as well as millions of American Marines in the Army.
So he believed that he could force Japan to surrender and effectively save many Japanese that way?
Right. And some also speculate that it was kind of a warning to the Soviet Union to tread lightly, because the Soviet Union had begun war on Japan as well. They were coming down through the Korean Peninsula, and
he knew that he was going to be the two remaining powers after the war. Most significantly, were going to be America and the Soviet Union, and he wanted to attempt to head off conflict there.
Right.
Would that be accurate?
Right. But instead came the Cold War, which is an argument as why people say it wasn't worth it to drop the bomb. Although in that current time, he didn't know the Cold War was going to happen. He also didn't know radiation sickness was a thing.
So they didn't know about radiation sickness when they had dropped the weapons? They didn't know that was going to be a problem?
Right.
Do you think that would have changed his decision to drop the actual bomb or not?
I believe not, if I'm honest.
Because the huge casualty differential that he saw?
Right. It's either 170,000 people die or...
Twice.
Yeah, twice. Or a couple million people die. So it's a hard decision to make, and he just decided to go through with the last casualty count. And on top of that, it also ended the kamikaze raids that were taking out significant numbers in the U.S. Navy.
So, the bombing, when it was dropped and intimidated the Soviet Union, helped create the Cold War nuclear arms race. Would that be an accurate statement?
It is.
So, as that arms race was possibly the only thing that prevented warfare between the two largest powers at the time in the world, would it be accurate to say that that nuclear bomb drop not just ended a war, but could have prevented another?
I'd say, well, it did start another. It started the Cold War, although there were not huge casualties in Cold War. There were some, but it's mostly secret.
Proxy wars.
Yeah, right. So, I'd say if the nuclear bomb wasn't dropped, there would be a lot. There would have been a lot more problems with Japan. It's probably still coming through to modern, because if he had decided to invade Japan like we talked about, he would have had to kill many civilians, which would have devastated Japan, and possibly they would not be a U.S. ally today. And also on top of that, the Cold War could have been a violent war rather than, by the name implies, a Cold War.
So, when he dropped the bomb, did he think that it was going to end the war definitively, or were there still plans in place after that?
I think they were expecting it to end it immediately, and after Japan did not surrender after the first atomic bomb, they decided to drop the second.
Rather than going in with their land invasion plan.
Right. And I don't necessarily know what they would have done if Japan didn't surrender after the second nuclear weapon. However, they did, so.
How were the targets that were selected chosen?
Actually, Hiroshima wasn't the first choice for a target. I believe it was Tokyo or near Tokyo, but the weather did not permit for the planes flying in that direction, so they went to their secondary target, which was Hiroshima.
And Nagasaki?
Nagasaki, Nagasaki was another main city. However, they did not want to bomb Tokyo because they had already done firebombing raids in Tokyo, and they already bombed Hiroshima. So Nagasaki was a third target for choice as well, and it was closer to Okasawa, I think. Yeah, and through that, some say also that the Nagasaki drop was a test for the plutonium weapon, because the first weapon was uranium, which was a lot more expensive to make. But plutonium, the bomb was smaller. It was also cheaper to make, and however, it did just as much damage.
What caused America to seek out a nuclear option for use in warfare? What instigated their search for...
Word had gotten out that the Germans were investigating nuclear powers, so the U.S. decided to do their own testing, and they tried to keep it secret. They didn't want anyone to know about it except for the main scientists. Like, even Harry Truman didn't know about it until he came into presidency when President Roosevelt died. Although there was a Soviet Union spy that infiltrated and found out about the nuclear arms. But the main thing that caused the U.S. to develop atomic weapons is word that Germany was doing the same.
They wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be reduced to dust with no option of striking back.
Right.
Shortly before the onset of the Second World War, the USSR and Germany came to an agreement that shocked the world. The agreement included provisions to split Eastern Europe.
Very shortly before the beginning of World War II, the Soviets and the Nazis came to an agreement that divvied up Poland and signed a non-aggression pact between them. They were direct ideological rivals, which made that this agreement one of the more surprising outcomes during the entirety of the war. And the question then is, why did the two nations decide to work together?
It appears that Stalin wanted to ally with Hitler just to buy time for himself to prepare. He offered a treaty with both England and France, but he didn't ever get a response, so a week later he allied with Hitler.
The British and the French have a history in world wars of not taking Russia seriously.
Yeah.
And also it has a history of not working out well for them, as demonstrated right there. He also, we know, gained territory throughout the course of the pact. He was divvying up a piece of...
They divvied up the whole Eastern Europe.
And he was attaining a level of expansionism that he would not have been able to attain, perhaps, or almost certainly on his own. And in the beginning of the war, his army was almost singularly unsuited to fighting something like the Germans, and their industrial base was really close to German territory. So if they had been fighting and been pushed back, the outcome could almost certainly have been the loss of their capability to produce more weapons and their loss. Through the time that he bought and the time that was spent dragging it out with the army during the war, the Russians managed to move their entire industrial base to the far side of the Ural Mountains, meaning that even as the Germans pushed them back, they weren't able to destroy the Russians' capability to produce weapons of war.
Which we think the time between him allying with Hitler and the German invasion was bought by Stalin on purpose.
Yes, it could also be that he was gaining from it, and if he lost, he had very little to lose. We don't have any evidence that proves that he was going to betray the pact. He wasn't necessarily buying time. He may just have been sitting there.
Just kind of trying to save his country as a whole without getting involved too much.
Sure. And if the Germans had won the war and kept the pact, he would have been in a pretty decent spot.
Right.
He had, instead of going from an area from a Europe that he knows trivializes him and doesn't particularly like working with him, especially since he's communist and there's not. He has a nation that has diplomatic ties to already that's willing to work with him in ruling over Europe in the end.
Okay. So even, let's say his goal was to buy time. Let's just go ahead with that. If that was his goal, was the goal successful?
I mean, almost certainly. We can say definitively that his army did a better job pushing the Germans back and holding the line, since they were able to have the tools to fight a war, and that their industrial base wasn't captured throughout the fighting, than they would have been had they not been able to fortify themselves, had they not been able to move their industrial base, and had they not been able to start mass production of things like tanks that were absolutely essential in defending against the Germans. Another question then is, if his goal was to ally with the Germans on a permanent basis, what resulted in him being willing to trust Hitler that he wouldn't violate the pact?
They both wanted to divide Eastern Europe up once they conquered it.
And in the end, he knows that Hitler has been giving anti-communist speeches, acts anti-communistly. To a certain degree, he and Hitler are on essentially opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. And so it seems a bit odd for him to trust a regime that seems to disagree with him so fundamentally to stick to its word. So that leads to the question, why did he trust Hitler?
I would say it's because he had no other choice. He had a weak army. They had an industrial base so near Germany. And the Allies didn't respond to his offer to help because they didn't take him seriously.
So he really had no option but to agree to the pact and hope that it worked out fine?
Right. It appears like that.
And they did seem to have some sort of common goal, was to get more land in the end.
Stalin
So he's
was
hoping
kind of...
that he would be devoted enough to the idea of expansionism without conflict on Hitler's part that he would be willing to work with them.
They both did want to expand and conquer more land, so it seemed, and they were both in a position to do that.
Yeah, I think his mindset was kind of like either he buys time for himself where he could get more prepared for a war with Germany if that was to come at any point, or if that war never happened, he would easily gain new land for his country.
So, Germany and the Soviet Union do agree to a non-aggression pact, and they both use that time to do a variety of things, one taking over Europe and the other one preparing for war. But we know that cost a lot of lives in the end.
Yeah.
Like, Germany was, in his agreement with Poland, Germany was evacuating most of the Polish population and killing them en masse. He agreed they were pulling Jews out of territory that they might not have been able to get. So in the end, is the agreement worth the cost in lives that it took?
I think that the agreement, if Germany did not decide to invade Russia, I do not believe that the loss of lives would have been worth it. However, thanks to, after the agreement, Germany invading Russia, and Russia ending up fighting for the Allies, it was worth it because...
It helped win the war.
Right.
So you're saying that...
But then, couldn't you say that it's a lot of Russians died in the war? And couldn't you say that the agreement would have saved those lives by costing others, and that since Stalin was the leader of Russia, not the entire world, it would be his responsibility to take care of primarily his own citizens?
But then he would have risked a war with Germany, correct?
No. We're saying that by agreeing to the pact and costing the lives of the people who in territory that he agreed to share with the Germans instead of conflicting over, what he's paying those lives in return for said pact.
Right.
So the central question is it worth the millions of lives lost to save time for Russia?
And
or
if he were to not invade, would just trading foreign lives for Russian lives worth it? And I would say, as the leader of Russia, trading foreign lives for Russian lives was always worth it for him.
Right.
Yeah.
And if they chose to invade, it was worth it for not just him, but history. So the pact was probably a good idea?
Yeah, I think the pact, no matter which way it went, had a net increase for Russia. Overall, it was a good choice for Stalin to make.
So who decided to betray the pact first?
Germany.
And that's when they invaded Russia, and Russia was only able to defend against them because of winter.
Right.
Winter, if you're going to invade Russia, winter is really bad for you.
Yes.
Which was a poor decision of Hitler, but...
Yes. And he believed that, and even beyond that, he believed that his troops would be so good at advancing that they wouldn't need any winter gear. So he didn't even winterize his forces.
So he was being, like, in a sense,
He
had a really big ego.
He had all the wrong plans, just
Right.
all of them.
Yeah. And that's when the pact ended on June 1914.
Our ninth person is Erwin Rommel, the German commander of the Africa Corps, who helped extend the war in Africa.
In another one of Italy's ill-fated adventures, they decided to invade Africa in an attempt to wrest Egypt out of the control of the British. And, as normal for World War II, Italy was absolutely routed and had to rely on German support to keep the development from becoming a disaster. In order to fortify Italian operations inside of the African theater of war, Hitler quickly put together a small task force of elite German troops, tank divisions, and air support units that was called the Africa Corps. It was inserted under the command of the recently promoted Field Marshal Erwin Rommel into the area around Egypt in which the Italian forces had dug themselves in, and they had with a configuration of supply lines, and they put this all together in an attempt to wrest control of Egypt from the British once and for all, allowing them to secure African oil fields to supply German tanks in their front against the Russians. And the British commander, once the Germans had arrived, was believing that there would be about a 6-month period before any definitive military operations could take place due to the lack of supplies under German command. But Erwin Rommel, in a rather surprising series of developments, routed British forces 4 times, pushed them back 650 miles, and tossed them almost to the Strait of Al Amen within a month of entering his theater of war. This is an example of the decisive, quick, and effective action taken by Erwin Rommel throughout almost the entirety of the Desert War, but it is also one of the clearest examples of its futility. Even though they managed to push the British forces back massively, due to the fact that they were operating in an almost endless sea of deserts, those losses had almost no real meaning, as no amount of capturing could simply not be answered by rebuilding. As long as the British or the German supply lines remained open, neither side could definitively win the war. So, as Rommel continued to fight and win battles against the British, he was consuming German and American British supplies. But due to the fact that America was backing the British side, producing an almost infinite amount of supplies for them, whereas Germany simply didn't have a parallel industrial engine, the Germans were far less able to fight a continuous desert war than the British and the Americans were. So, the question then becomes, was it correct of Rommel to continue to fight in Germany, even though he was winning battles and he was attempting to push for his country to secure the oil fields that they needed to secure their advances in Russia? Or would it have been a better tactical decision for him to have lost or for him to have retreated from the area in an attempt to stop the use of resources that were necessitated in other places on a front that the Germans could not definitively win, nor could they ever definitively lose until such time that their supply lines were finally closed? It is known that Erwin Rommel was winning quite frequently his battles in Africa, but it's also clear that victories didn't really have very much of a meaning when retreat was virtually infinite. So was it right to attempt to continue a war that cost resources without any real goal of or way of ending it definitively?
Well, what was his goal in the first place?
So, as we stated, Italy invaded Africa. Well, a bunch of countries in Africa, for Italy reasons, which means no good. And so, as they were losing, because that's what they do, Germany had to sweep in to attempt to stabilize the situation, because they didn't want major military defeats that could threaten the Tremper oil fields, which were allowing their tanks to run in their invasion of Russia. And so the Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel was brought in an attempt to stabilize the situation and keep their oil flowing.
So what they were really fighting for was oil in the long run.
Yes?
They were attempting to seize the resources within Africa, but in the attempt to seize the resources, they used them.
They used far more than they were ever really able to pull out.
So the only real good part that came from the invasion of Egypt was a distraction of the Allies.
Yes, but the Allies had something like the American industrial machine behind them,
Correct.
Which meant that they could make 3 times as many tanks, planes, soldiers, and guns as the Axis, and they had control to many different oil fields, so they never really were threatened by the loss of the turboxets. So their loss of resources, they were far more able to maintain over time and rebuild up than the Axis were.
Correct.
So their whole going against them to try and get these resources, it didn't really do much for them other than, like, basically what they used they would replace.
That was the goal, but in the end what they wound up using was things that they couldn't replace,
right,
being tanks and people. Mm-hmm. Because while the German army was large, it's also finite.
Yes.
And Russia does a really good job of eating a lot of people very, very quickly. And so they really could use as many bodies as they could throw around.
Right. So at that point, he should have just stopped, right?
It could be argued, but stopping and losing that war isn't something that's costless. They are losing access to their largest oil field. And the only real way they have of replacing that is by winning on the Russian front.
Which
Right.
they were finding to be impossible.
Well, at the time, they were doing very well on the Russian front because it was still summer.
Well, then they should have gone with that rather than continue to attack Egypt.
But if they are, as they viewed themselves at least to be, capable of winning in Russia, because they were advancing almost unabated, then what's the point of not fighting the Egypt war when they believe they can seize major British colonies?
So
A lot of the British industrial power didn't come from Britain. Britain is terrible at growing food and terrible at producing enough resources to even keep Britain running.
Right.
They came from colonies. Like, more of the British military power came from Australia than came from the actual country of Britain.
Right.
Makes sense.
So trying to cut off some of their most major colonies, those in Africa, was definitely a benefit for the Germans. And the Germans' ultimate goal was the domination of most of, if not all of the earth. And so winning in Africa is an advancement of that plan. Maybe not to anywhere near the degree of things in the European theater are, but it is a goal that they can complete here.
So Rommel's choice was either continue to fight the war they thought they were going to win in the first place and keep that war going, or retreat and focus that war somewhere else, whereas they would feel they needed to return to the place where he would leave anyway.
Which was probably one of the driving factors. Another one of the things that we know affected Rommel's decision-making was the fact that he really liked his appearance as a media general. He was a symbol of German military might. He was their premier general that they showed above the others, and that was really displayed in his work in Africa. He was winning battles a lot, and they took pictures of him, they filmed him, and he really liked being the center of attention, being a media icon.
And also turned into a propaganda thing, right?
And being a hero. He really liked being the German hero. So that push to succeed in the war that he was winning battles in,
It does seem
rather
like a
than...
bit of a selfish reason for him, though.
So
Yes, it is, but people are defined by reasons both selfish and non.
So his rapid victories could have led to sort of a blindness where he just kept charging at the enemy.
That does seem to have occurred. Like, he was defeating enemy forces, and then instead of stopping in places, resting his troops up and trying to resupply, he would push on further. And Rommel, and the Desert War is often categorized by not a single engagement, but by a string of engagements in which one army retreats a few hundred miles, and then it happens the other way, and the other army retreats a few hundred miles because the distance is almost meaningless.
So what was...
And Rommel had a category where he won almost always the first of those strings of engagements. And he would just keep on fighting them until he had worn his machine down to the degree where winning any more was virtually impossible for him.
So the decision that he ended up making was to keep fighting.
For any number of reasons, ego is probably one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you say it was the biggest reason, though?
Probably not, considering
the
that
biggest reason is probably the movement of the war itself, him wanting
Yeah.
to continue and
attempt to win for Germany.
keep the Aryan race going and destroy the earth. And
Well, if you
Take
look
it
at
over.
his political history, he was more of a German than he was of a Nazi.
yeah,
Right.
So, maybe not the Aryan race, but definitely the Germany take over the world a bit. But the Tobruk oil field's importance is definitely significant. And he knew that. He was driving tanks that they supplied because of them.
right.
Germany Europe has virtually no way of really getting oil from
Right,
within
unless
itself.
it's
It
to
has
attack,
to buy it
yes.
out, or it has to conquer something. And there were two real options for oil fields. One's in Russia and one's in Africa that they had. And Rommel was going to push, and was pushing, for the ones in Africa reasonably effectively, and he was getting oil in.
So he had a good reason to continue fighting. He was winning. He thought he could win.
But like you said earlier, the oil wasn't enough.
And when you look at the outcome of the Desert War, you see that victories didn't mean anything because you could just retreat another 500 miles.
Yeah, because the desert is
And it wound up
endlessly
being
open.
who can get more guns, who can get more people, who can get more tanks. And
But even then, you're wasting more
So
resources
the war-
trying to get one.
So the war wasn't a war for land. It was basically, or between.
It was
It
a war
wasn't
for
limited. It
resources.
wasn't limited between people and land. It was limited between with resources.
yes and no. There were definitely important points. There were fortresses and defense lines that people held.
Oh, of course.
But those tended to be hundreds of miles away from each other.
Yeah.
Not all the land that they were fighting over was meaningless, but a lot of it just was mine one day, yours the next.
Right.
Right. So Rommel saw the battle as he kept fighting. He kept winning. He was going to continue. However, he didn't know resources were limited and that the
It's-
Allies had more.
It's very
resources.
possible that he did know, but he thought that he could overcome it. He was systematically defeating numerically superior foes, but in the end, supply lines did get to him. And it really looks like he was blinded to that fact. He was a general who had a tunnel vision when it came to warfare. He was excellent at strategy, winning battles, and doing that, but he was always more blinded to the boring humdrum series of systems of warfare, which were things like getting his troops fed, getting his tanks oiled, and putting guns in hands.
So Rommel seems to like the action, not the prepare for the action.
And that
Definitely.
also seems to go back to the ego thing.
Yeah, he does seem to be a dynamic figure, and he sees himself that way. He had a habit when he was a commander in World War I and in France during World War II of unplugging his radio, ignoring high command, and then just charging into enemy forces.
He could have done much better, though, if he would have
He
listened and...
decimated them. He won victories continuously.
Yeah, right.
But in Africa, winning a victory continuously pushes your enemy back 600 miles that don't matter, then gets you defeated again.
Right.
Because they're standing right next to their supply depots, and when you order a ration, it doesn't get to you for a month.
So do you think that the consequences of losing outweigh everything else?
I would argue that not even losing, continuing to fight, is more damaging than anything that they were doing.
I think
because
so,
it just
too.
cost them men, tanks, and guns in the end.
And
So it
resources.
seems like Rommel should have chosen to move to Russia, where his
Ability to non-stop win battles
would have been much more effective rather than
and
in Africa.
helpful,
However, he chose
which
to
is a
continue.
desert.
because he thought that he could win and he wasn't fully aware of the limitations that were imposed on him. That does seem to be the case. Thank you for listening.